In the dusty heart of El Paso, Texas, long before the chants, the lights, or the roaring fans, there was a boy born into the world of lucha libre. His name was Eduardo Gory Guerrero Yanes, but to millions, he would become Eddie Guerrero, one of the most beloved and tragic figures in professional wrestling history. But before the world knew his name, before he became a champion, he was simply the youngest son of the legendary Guerrero wrestling dynasty. Eddie was born on October 9th, 1967, into a family where wrestling wasn't just a career, it was a birthright. His father, Gory Guerrero, was a pioneer in Mexican wrestling, a tough technical mastermind who helped build lucha libre from the ground up. Gory wasn't just famous, he was revered. He helped design the very architecture of modern wrestling in Mexico. And in that shadow, Eddie grew up watching his older brothers, Chavo, Mando, Hector, all walk the path of the ring. It was inevitable that he would follow. Wrestling wasn't something he chose. It was in his blood, flowing through his veins like fire. But unlike the others, Eddie was different. He didn't just want to wrestle, he wanted to be the best. From a young age, he was obsessed. He trained constantly, studied tapes, practiced moves on makeshift rings in the backyard of their home. He wasn't just learning technique, he was learning passion, performance, and pain. At the University of New Mexico, Eddie wrestled on a collegiate level, showcasing his raw athleticism. But the classroom and the normal life of a student never fit him. He wasn't made for lectures. He was made for the lights, for the roar, for the drama. By the early 1990s, Eddie Guerrero was already wrestling in Mexico and Japan, dazzling fans with his aerial speed, technical finesse, and charisma. In New Japan Pro Wrestling, he performed under a mask as Black Tiger II, facing legends like Chris Benoit and Dean Malenko. He wasn't a big man, not by WWE standards, but he was a giant in the ring. His ability to fly, to sell, to tell stories, it was almost supernatural. You couldn't look away. But this was just the beginning. Fame was calling. America was watching. Soon, Eddie would step onto the stage of WCW and into a world that was bigger, brighter, and more dangerous than he ever imagined. The spotlight was coming, and with it, the shadows. Eddie Guerrero stepped into World Championship Wrestling, WCW, in the mid-1990s, and instantly, his presence was undeniable. While the promotion was dominated by towering figures like Hulk Hogan and the NWO, Eddie brought something they didn't have: pure, unapologetic wrestling mastery. With his lightning-fast reversals, high-risk aerial assaults, and fluid storytelling in the ring, Eddie Guerrero quickly became one of the best technical performers in WCW, alongside men like Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko, and Rey Mysterio. He wasn't flashy in the conventional sense. He wasn't 6'6" or a muscle-bound monster. But the fans, they felt him. His matches weren't just physical contests, they were works of art. And yet, the brighter the spotlight became, the more shadows began to creep in behind it. Fame came fast, but so did the pressure. Eddie was now traveling constantly, town to town, night after night, rarely seeing his wife, Vicky Guerrero, or their young daughter, Shaul. The wear and tear on his body were relentless. Injuries began to pile up. And with them came the pills, painkillers, sleeping aids, and something even darker: alcohol. What started as casual use quickly spiraled into dependency. Eddie, like so many others in the wrestling world, began using substances to numb the pain, to keep going, to stay on the road, to fight through injury after injury. But the longer he pushed, the more he fell apart. His personal life suffered. His marriage grew tense. Arguments, absences, and erratic behavior became more frequent. Vicky tried to hold things together for Eddie, for their child, for the legacy. But addiction is a storm that doesn't care who it breaks. By the late 90s, Eddie's performances were still brilliant, but off-screen, he was drifting, fading. In 2000, Eddie finally joined the WWE part of the Radicals faction alongside Benoit, Malenko, and Saturn. For a moment, it looked like a fresh start. He had momentum, he had fans, he had talent that couldn't be denied. But addiction doesn't wait for timing. During his early WWE run, things went from bad to worse. In May 2001, after repeated issues, Eddie Guerrero was released from the company, fired, cut loose. It was the lowest point of his life. His dream was gone. His marriage was on the rocks. His body was broken. He was drowning in addiction. And worst of all, he knew it was his fault. In interviews later, he admitted, "I should have died. I should have been in a ditch, but God didn't let me go." This wasn't a story about wrestling anymore. It was about survival. What do you do when you've lost everything? When the world turns its back and the mirror shows you a man you no longer recognize? You rebuild. One painful, slow, desperate step at a time. The year was 2001. Eddie Guerrero had hit rock bottom. Fired from the WWE. Addicted. Alienated. Broken. Most men don't come back from that. But Eddie Guerrero wasn't most men. Somewhere deep inside the pain, the shame, and the isolation, something refused to give up. Maybe it was the voice of his father. Maybe it was the image of his daughter. Maybe it was God. Whatever it was, it whispered one word louder than the rest: fight. Eddie checked himself into rehab. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. There were no fans cheering from the seats, no music blaring from the speakers, just silence, reflection, and pain. He later described the process as excruciating, confronting the man he had become and trying to find the man he once was. But little by little, the fog began to clear. He reconnected with Vicky, who had nearly left him but decided to believe one last time that Eddie could change. He found faith not just in himself, but in God. For the first time in a long time, Eddie prayed, truly prayed, not for success, not for a title, but for forgiveness. Then he started wrestling again, not on big stages, but in small independent circuits, in front of hundreds, sometimes dozens of fans, humble places, humble beginnings. But in those tiny gyms and town halls, Eddie rediscovered why he wrestled in the first place. Not for fame, not for the money, but because the ring was his sanctuary, the place where he was free, and the world took notice. By 2002, WWE came calling again. They saw the change, the hunger, the humility. He wasn't the same man they had let go. He was sharper, leaner, focused, and finally clean. So Vince McMahon took a risk. He gave Eddie another shot. And this time, Eddie wasn't going to let go. He returned to WWE with fire in his eyes and redemption in his soul. Fans noticed the difference. There was a new edge to him, raw, unpredictable, and electric. He was no longer trying to fit a mold. He was just Eddie. Real, flawed, but alive. He didn't pretend to be perfect. He didn't try to hide his past. Instead, he embraced it. He said it out loud. I lie. I cheat. I steal. But I do it with a smile. It was a gimmick, sure, but it was also real. The fans could see it, a man who had fallen, risen, and was still fighting. And they loved him for it. His matches were masterpieces filled with soul, psychology, and improvisation. He reunited with his nephew, Chavo Guerrero, forming the wildly entertaining Los Guerreros tag team. Their backstage vignettes were hilarious. Their chemistry was effortless. Their catchphrase became iconic. We lie, we cheat, we steal, but at least we're honest about it. Eddie was winning again. But more importantly, he was living again. By 2003, Eddie Guerrero wasn't just back, he was on fire. Every arena he stepped into, every match he wrestled, there was an energy, a spark no one else could match. He wasn't the biggest. He wasn't the loudest. But when he stepped through the curtain, the fans exploded. He had become something rare in wrestling, a flawed hero. One who didn't hide his past, but wore it like armor. He embraced the name Latino Heat, a blend of fiery passion, swagger, and street-smart charisma. He was funny, unpredictable, and insanely talented in the ring. You never quite knew what Eddie would do next, and that made him must-see. The fans adored him, not because he was perfect, but because he was real. He represented the struggle, the hustle, the comeback. And deep down, everyone loves a good redemption story. In 2003, Eddie started climbing the ladder in WWE's singles division. He won the United States Championship, delivering thrilling performances night after night. Then, he set his sights on bigger gold, the WWE Championship, the very top of the mountain. It was a long shot. He wasn't the corporate image of a champion. He didn't have the massive build or the smooth corporate delivery, but he had something more important: heart, soul, and the people. And so came February 15, 2004. No Way Out. Eddie Guerrero versus Brock Lesnar for the WWE Championship. It was David versus Goliath. The powerhouse versus the survivor. The system versus the soul. Lesnar dominated much of the match. The crowd held its breath as Eddie was thrown, slammed, punished, but he never stopped moving, never stopped believing. In the final moments after countering an F5 and hitting the frog splash, Eddie pinned Lesnar. Son. The crowd exploded. Eddie Guerrero had just become WWE champion. As the referee handed him the title, Eddie collapsed in tears. Not dramatic, performative tears, but real, unstoppable tears of a man who had crawled out of hell and made it to heaven. He climbed into the crowd, hugged fans, kissed children, clutched the title like it was a second chance made flesh. In the ring, he raised the belt high as his music played. Viva La Raza. It wasn't just a win for Eddie. It was a win for every person who ever made a mistake and fought their way back. And then came WrestleMania 20. On one side of the card, Eddie Guerrero defended his WWE title against Kurt Angle, a classic, hard-hitting technical battle that showed the world why Eddie was among the best to ever do it. He retained, and later that night, his best friend Chris Benoit won the World Heavyweight Championship in the main event. In a moment that still haunts and heals wrestling fans, Eddie walked down the ramp, WWE title on his shoulder, tears in his eyes. He embraced Benoit in the ring. Two men, two friends, who had fought for years just to be taken seriously, finally standing tall, both as world champions. It was one of the most emotional endings to a WrestleMania in WWE history. For once, the good guys had won. After WrestleMania 20X, Eddie Guerrero wasn't just a champion, he was a symbol. A symbol of what wrestling could be. A symbol of redemption. A symbol of heart. But Eddie wasn't content to sit on the throne and smile for the cameras. No, he wanted to entertain, to surprise, to push the art of wrestling in new directions. So he leaned into the character that had brought him this far. The lovable trickster, the cunning rogue, the master manipulator. I lie, I cheat, I steal. Not just a catchphrase, a lifestyle. But here's the thing. Everyone knew he was lying, cheating, and stealing, and yet they cheered louder. Why? Because Eddie never lied for evil. He lied to outsmart the powerful. He cheated to win over the bullies. He stole because, in a world built to hold him back, he had to find his own way forward. He became the Robin Hood of wrestling the people's rogue. From 2004 to 2005, Eddie's reign was full of classic moments and fierce rivalries. He battled JBL in a deeply personal feud, culminating in a brutal Texas bull rope match. Bloodied and battered, Eddie lost the title but never lost the crowd. If anything, his popularity soared. He was the underdog again, and people loved cheering him from beneath. But perhaps his most emotionally complex feud came with someone he once called family, Rey Mysterio. In 2005, WWE scripted a storyline that blurred fiction and reality, a tale involving Rey's real-life son, Dominic. The story was outrageous. Eddie claimed he was actually Dominic's biological father and had let Rey raise the boy out of kindness. It was classic Eddie manipulative. dramatic, full of twisted emotion. But underneath the outrageous plot, there was something deeply personal. The pain in Eddie's eyes when he delivered the lines, the bitterness in his voice when he shouted, "I'm your Poppy." It didn't feel like acting. It felt like a man pouring real heartbreak into the only place he knew how, the ring. Even at his most villainous, the fans couldn't hate him. Because they saw the struggle, the humanity, the depth. Eddie wasn't playing a part. He was the part. A man who had lived through more than most and turned that pain into performance. Backstage, his peers loved him. He was known for helping young talent, giving advice, lifting spirits. He wasn't just a superstar, he was a leader, a brother, a survivor. But the fire that made Eddie so bright was beginning to burn him from the inside out. By late 2005, Eddie Guerrero was on top of the world, but also running on empty. Behind the smile, behind the swagger, there was a man exhausted physically, mentally, emotionally. He had overcome addiction. He had reclaimed his legacy. He had built himself from broken pieces. But the cost of that climb was immense. Eddie had been pushing his body for nearly 2 decades, hundreds of matches, countless injuries, long nights, painkillers replaced by caffeine, workouts, twice a day, cardio, until he could barely breathe. All to stay at the top. All to prove to himself, to his family, to the world that he was worthy. He had beaten the demons of drugs and alcohol. But now he was fighting a quieter enemy: overwork, stress, and pressure. People backstage noticed. He wasn't smiling as much. He was quieter, focused, almost too focused. Still, he insisted he was fine. "I'm doing this for my family," he'd say. And he meant it. Eddie loved his wife, Vicky, with every ounce of his heart. He adored his daughters, especially Shaul, who was now growing into a young woman, inspired by her father's resilience. He wanted to leave a legacy. He wanted to die remembered not as a failure, but as a fighter. On November 11, 2005, Eddie wrestled his final match, a SmackDown main event against Mr. Kennedy. It was textbook Eddie, creative, intense, full of psychology and fire. No one could have guessed it would be the last time he'd ever step in the ring. On the morning of November 13, 2005, Eddie Guerrero was found unresponsive in his hotel room in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was just 38 years old. His nephew, Chavo Guerrero, was the one who discovered him. Emergency services arrived, but it was too late. Eddie had died in his sleep of acute heart failure. Just like that, the heartbeat of wrestling stopped. When the news broke, the wrestling world collapsed in grief. Fans sobbed in the streets. Wrestlers fell to their knees backstage. Entire locker rooms went silent. Even men who rarely showed emotion, like Batista, Chris Benoit, Rey Mysterio, were filmed in tears. WWE canceled the usual scripts that week. Instead, both Raw and SmackDown became tribute shows. No storylines, no characters, just real people mourning a real man. His entrance music played, but there was no one walking out. His lowrider sat at the stage, but the seat was empty. Rey Mysterio, choking back tears, said, "I miss you, Eddie. I love you. You'll always be with us." Batista, barely able to speak, stared at the camera and whispered, "Thank you for everything. I'll never forget you." And Chavo, broken, shattered, stood in the ring and saluted the uncle who raised him like a brother. Eddie was gone, but his story was far from over. The ring was empty. The lowrider was silent. But somehow, Eddie was still there. You could feel it in the tears of the crowd, in the tributes of his peers, in the way the entire wrestling world paused to honor a man who had changed everything. After Eddie's death, WWE didn't just move on. They paid tribute, not for a night, but for years. His memory became part of the very DNA of the company. Rey Mysterio, Perhaps the person closest to Eddie in his final years was devastated. But instead of retreating, he made a promise. Every time I step into that ring, it's for Eddie. He began wearing Eddie's initials on his gear. He used Eddie's signature moves. He pointed to the sky before every match, not out of superstition, but out of love. In early 2006, just months after Eddie's passing, Rey Mysterio entered the Royal Rumble match, the biggest annual battle in WWE. No one expected him to last long. But Rey, channeling something far deeper than strength, lasted over an hour, setting a record and winning the entire match. He pointed to the heavens. He said, "This is for you, Eddie." The crowd roared. At WrestleMania 22, Rey challenged for the World Heavyweight Championship. The odds were stacked against him. But then, Eddie's theme played. A lowrider appeared on the screen. Rey stepped out, wearing Eddie's colors, energy vibrating through the arena. He won the match. He held the title high. He looked up and cried. The underdog had done it. Not alone, but with Eddie beside him. Meanwhile, Vicky Guerrero, Eddie's widow, emerged into a spotlight she had never asked for. She wasn't a wrestler. She wasn't a performer. She was a grieving wife. But the fans embraced her. And she, too, chose to carry on Eddie's legacy, stepping into the WWE as a manager, a voice, and eventually, one of the most iconic female authority figures in company history. Her catchphrase, "Excuse me," became infamous, but behind the comedy was a woman fueled by love. She kept Eddie's memory alive, not just in name, but in presence. She honored him with every show, with every appearance. And then came the next generation. Eddie Guerrero, Eddie's daughter, followed her father's footsteps into the ring. She trained in WWE's developmental system, carrying the Guerrero legacy into a new era. She didn't try to replace Eddie. She tried to reflect him. A little attitude, a lot of passion, a heart full of heritage. Even those who never met Eddie, wrestlers who entered the business years after he was gone, speak of him like a guiding light. They watched his matches religiously. They studied his timing, his storytelling, his fire. To many, Eddie Guerrero wasn't just a wrestler. He was a standard. And perhaps the most beautiful tribute came from the fans themselves. Every time someone shouts, "Latino heat," every time someone hits the Three Amigos suplex combo, every time a wrestler lies down, fakes an injury, and tricks the ref with a mischievous grin, Eddie Guerrero lives again. He may have left this world far too soon, but he gave it everything while he was here. His heart, his flaws, his laughter, his pain, and above all, his love. Time has passed. The ring ropes have been replaced. The arenas have changed. New names fill the marquee. But in every chant, every cheer, every flicker of passion that echoes through a WWE crowd, Eddie Guerrero is still there. He was never the tallest, never the loudest, never the chosen one. But through pure heart, raw honesty, and unshakable resilience, Eddie became something far greater. A symbol of second chances for those who fall, for those who break, for those who lose everything and still find the courage to rise. A symbol of family, of loving fiercely, forgiving deeply, and fighting for the people who matter most. A symbol of truth, not perfection, but humanity. A man who exposed his flaws to the world and was loved because of them, not despite them. Eddie's story wasn't about gold belts or 5-star matches. It was about redemption. It was about a man who fell deeper than most, who looked his demons in the eye and chose to live differently. He turned pain into art. He turned guilt into laughter. He turned struggle into inspiration. To this day, WWE superstars continue to honor him. Sasha Banks cries when she speaks of how Eddie inspired her to dream. Kevin Owens wears Eddie's shirts under his gear. Dominic Mysterio, once the little boy in Eddie's storyline, is now a WWE star himself, a living bridge between past and present. And every time someone slaps their chest, grins at the crowd, and shouts, Viva La Raza, they aren't just quoting a catchphrase. They're keeping a spirit alive. Eddie once said, I'm not the biggest, I'm not the strongest, but I have the biggest heart. And in the end, that heart was enough to change the world. He taught us that being broken doesn't mean you're finished. That being real is more powerful than being perfect. That no matter where you've been, if you fight with love, you can still find peace. Eddie Guerrero died on November 13, 2005. But Eddie Guerrero never left. He lives in the stories. He lives in the matches. He lives in every fan who believed that redemption is real. Viva La Raza. Rest in power, Eddie. We'll never forget you.